It all started on an otherwise ordinary evening. My 5-year-old son, Danny, had been acting strangely all day. He's always been a bit imaginative, but that night, his insistence sent chills down my spine. "Mom, there's someone in my closet," he whispered, clutching his teddy bear tightly. I smiled at first, thinking it was just one of his usual bedtime fears. But there was something in his eyes, a kind of terror I'd never seen before. Trying to calm him, I sat on the edge of his bed and promised to check. I opened the closet door wide, revealing nothing but rows of tiny clothes and scattered toys. "See, there's no one here," I said reassuringly. Danny didn't look convinced. He grabbed my hand and whispered, "They hide when you look." A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off as childish imagination. I kissed his forehead, tucked him in, and turned off the light, leaving the door slightly ajar as he liked. Hours passed, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered. Danny's words echoed in my mind. They hide when you look. As a parent, you want to protect your child from everything, but what if he wasn't imagining it? What if he was right? Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the faint sound of creaking floorboards. My husband was snoring softly beside me, completely unaware. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. A deliberate, slow creak. It was coming from Danny's room. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone for light and crept down the hall. As I neared his room, I noticed the door was fully open now. Danny was sitting up in bed, his wide eyes locked on the closet. "Mom," he whispered, "they're moving." My throat went dry. The room was so still it felt like time had stopped. I stepped inside, turning the flashlight toward the closet. The door, which I had left ajar, was now completely closed. My hands shook as I reached for the handle. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe just the house settling or my son's overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew better. With one swift motion, I yanked the door open. The light revealed only the same clothes and toys from before. No sign of anything unusual. Yet Danny's fear didn't waver. "They're hiding again," he whispered, his voice trembling. I tried to stay composed, but my heart was racing. Something wasn't right. Unable to sleep, I sat in the living room, keeping watch on Danny's room from a distance. My husband still didn't seem concerned when I told him about Danny's fears. "He's just a hun. Kids see monsters everywhere," he said before going back to sleep. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing unease in my chest. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the creak of floorboards. This time, it was unmistakable. It wasn't coming from Danny's room, but from the hallway. Slowly, I got up, clutching my phone like a weapon. As I moved closer to the sound, I felt a cold draft brush against my skin. The hallway light flickered as I stepped forward. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I pushed forward, peering into Danny's room. He was still awake, his wide eyes staring at the closet. The door was open again, just slightly this time. My breath hitched as I noticed a shadow moving inside. Not large enough to be a person, but too big to be a toy. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. No response. Summoning every ounce of courage, I marched to the closet, threw the door open, and nothing. Just Danny's clothes and a single misplaced shoe. "Mom, they're laughing at us," Danny whispered, and then I heard it too. A faint, muffled chuckle coming from behind me. My heart leaped into my throat. Spinning around, I shone the flashlight across the room, but it was empty. The sound had stopped, but the air felt heavier, suffocating. Danny whimpered, pulling the blanket over his head. "Don't let them take me, Mom," he sobbed. I rushed to his side, holding him tightly. "No one is going to take you," I promised, though my own fear betrayed me. Suddenly, my phone buzzed, a notification. I glanced at the screen to see a security alert. Motion detected in the hallway. I froze, staring at the live feed from our home security camera. The hallway was empty, at first. Then the camera flickered, and for a split second I saw it. A figure slipping into Danny's room. My hands trembled as I turned to the doorway. There was nothing there now, but I could feel it. Someone, or something, was here. "Stay here," I whispered to Danny, grabbing the nearest heavy object I could find, a table lamp. My husband finally woke up, groggy and confused, as I explained what I saw. Together, we decided to check every corner of the house, starting with Danny's room. My husband took the lead, swinging the closet door wide open. At first, it looked like before, nothing but clothes and toys. But then, he crouched down, peering into the shadows at the back. His hand froze mid-reach. "Call the police," he said, his voice low and urgent. I barely had time to react before he yanked something out. No, someone. A man, disheveled and wild-eyed, stumbled out of the closet, clutching a knife. My scream caught in my throat as my husband wrestled him to the ground. The intruder's strength was terrifying, but adrenaline fueled us both. Danny's screams filled the air as I grabbed him and ran to the hallway, locking the door behind us. The police arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours. They subdued the man and took him away, but the horror didn't end there. He had been hiding in our home for hours, slipping in through an unlocked window during the day. And the worst part? The police found a makeshift bed in the attic, littered with candy wrappers and a notebook filled with unsettling drawings of my family. For days, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and shadow in the house sent me into a panic. Danny refused to go near his room, and honestly, I didn't blame him. We installed new locks, cameras, and an alarm system. But the sense of security we once had was gone. The thought of someone watching us, living among us, sent chills down my spine. Danny's fear slowly subsided, but mine didn't. I kept replaying the intruder's face in my mind, the way he had looked at us as if we were his prey, and his notebook, the drawings of us sleeping, eating, living our lives, completely unaware. It was as if he had been studying us, waiting for the right moment. Sometimes, late at night, I hear Danny talking in his sleep. "They're still here," he mumbles. I try to convince myself it's just the trauma, a child's way of processing the unthinkable. But part of me wonders if he knows something I don't. Life eventually returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the scars of that night remain. Danny's closet became a storage space. His toys moved to a different room. I thought we were safe, that we had taken every precaution to protect our home. But last week, while cleaning the attic, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tucked behind an old box was a single piece of paper, yellowed and crumpled. It was one of the intruder's drawings, a crude sketch of our family, but this one was different. In it, Danny was standing alone, holding hands with a dark figure with hollow eyes, and scrawled at the bottom were the words, "I'll be back." I haven't told Danny, I haven't told my husband, but every night I sit awake clutching a bat, waiting for the sound of creaking floorboards, because I know he wasn't working alone, and whoever, or whatever, was with him might already be here. It all started when I was 14. Back then, I believed the soft sounds of footsteps and the creak of my bedroom door late at night were nothing more than my mother checking on me. She had always been a worrier, constantly fretting over every little thing, so her hovering at night didn't surprise me. It was something I noticed occasionally, but never thought much about. Most nights, I would be too sleepy to stay awake, and the noises would fade into the background as I drifted off again. For years, this became a semi-regular occurrence, but it didn't scare me. I wasn't the type to spook easily, and I usually found logical explanations for strange happenings. That sense of comfort lasted until I was 17. One night, everything changed. I was lying in bed, my door closed but not locked. The sound of soft footsteps wasn't what woke me this time. It was a cool breeze that sent a shiver down my spine. As I began to adjust my blanket, I froze. Papers on my desk, a stack of drawings I'd been working on, rustled softly, as if someone were sorting through them. My heart pounded as I held my breath. My parents weren't home. It was the first night they had ever left me completely alone. My mother, being the overly cautious woman she was, had argued against leaving me, even though I was clearly old enough. I wanted to believe it was them returning early, but I couldn't risk moving to check. I lay still, barely breathing, praying that whoever or whatever was in my room would leave. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually the presence vanished. I didn't dare get up to look. Only when the first light of dawn crept through the window did I summon the courage to check my room. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but I noticed something strange. The paint on my drawings was slightly smudged. When my parents returned later that day, I told my father what had happened. I made him swear not to tell my mother. I knew how much it would feed her anxiety. He agreed and conducted a thorough search of the house. Every door and window was locked, and there was no sign of a break-in. "Are you absolutely sure you didn't imagine it?" he asked gently. I shook my head. I wasn't sure about anything anymore. Over the next few years, the visitor remained a part of my life. It came and went without warning, and I could never predict when it would appear. Sometimes I would feel its presence. Other times, I slept through the night, blissfully unaware of its visits. Only when I moved away to college did the occurrences stop. For a brief time, I allowed myself to believe it had all been in my head. Yet, every time I came home, the feeling returned. Determined to get answers, I set up a camera in my room, hoping to capture evidence. But every recording showed nothing. No one entered the room, no shadows moved. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. A few months ago, I graduated college with a degree in graphic design and decided to move back home. I told my parents I wanted to gain some experience working at the local newspaper before pursuing bigger opportunities. The truth was, I wasn't ready to live alone, and the familiarity of my childhood home brought me comfort. My mother was thrilled, of course. She had always been happier when I was close by. I reconnected with a few old schoolmates. Jess, a writer at the newspaper, became one of my closest friends. She introduced me to Corey, someone I vaguely remembered from high school. The three of us quickly became inseparable, spending our evenings laughing over shared memories and dreams of escaping our small town. For a while, life seemed normal. I had friends, a steady routine, and a sense of stability I hadn't felt in years. But that sense of peace shattered one evening when Corey called us with horrifying news. A young man's body had been discovered outside the grocery store. His heart had been ripped out. The gruesome nature of the crime sent shockwaves through our quiet town. As the story unfolded, we learned that similar murders had occurred 30 years ago. 3 people had died in the same horrifying manner, their hearts taken. The town imposed an immediate curfew. People locked their doors and stayed indoors after dark. Fear settled over the community like a heavy fog. My parents were on edge. They gave me strict rules to follow. Don't go out after dark, keep my window locked, and always let them know where I was. I didn't argue. I felt their unease as much as my own. But there was something about their fear that felt different, almost personal. The victim was identified as Rick Matthews, someone I had known from school. Though we weren't friends, his death struck a chord. He had been my age. His life, full of potential, had been snatched away in the most violent way imaginable. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of Rick and the chilling possibility that the killer might still be nearby. My door creaked open in the middle of the night. My body froze. Footsteps approached my bed, and I felt a damp, cold hand brush my cheek. A scream tore from my throat. My parents burst into the room. My mother wrapped me in her arms, whispering reassurances. My father checked the windows and corners of the room, but found nothing. When my mother pulled away, I noticed blood on her hand. She wiped it away wordlessly, her expression unreadable. "You're protected," she whispered, her voice trembling. The next morning, another body was found. This time, it was Jess. The news shattered me. I had just spoken to her days before. Her laughter still echoed in my ears. Now she was gone. Grief consumed me, and I spent the next few days in bed, unable to face the world. Corey came to visit me, his face pale and his voice hoarse. He proposed a memorial for Jess at a lakeside spot where they had spent many evenings. Despite my fear in the town's curfew, I agreed. I needed closure. We drove to the lake in Corey's car. Halfway there, he veered off the main road, claiming it was blocked. Unease prickled at the back of my mind. I reached for my phone, but it was missing. Corey's smile sent chills down my spine. "You shouldn't have left it in your bag," he said, his tone casual. "There's a murderer on the loose after all." Panic set in as he continued driving into the woods. His demeanor shifted, and he began talking about a family tradition, one tied to the murders. My name, he explained with a sinister grin, was carved into a tree near the lake. It was a dying spot. Corey pulled out a dagger, and I bolted from the car. My feet carried me deep into the forest, my heart pounding in my chest. I tripped over something and fell hard, my knees scraping against the dirt. As I looked down, I saw what had caused me to stumble. A candle, flickering at the base of a tree, with my name carved into its bark. Corey's footsteps grew louder. He stood over me, the dagger glinting in his hand. "Don't worry," he said with a twisted smile. "It ends after 3, then we're safe for another 30 years. He raised the dagger, and I braced myself, but instead of pain, I heard a sickening thud. When I opened my eyes, Corey lay lifeless on the ground, the dagger buried in his chest. My mother appeared moments later, her face etched with worry. She pulled me into her arms, her relief palpable. When she saw Corey's body, her expression darkened. She noticed the tree with my name carved into it and whispered, "She protected you." "She?" I asked, my voice trembling. My mother's eyes filled with tears. "My sister." Back at home, my mother revealed the truth. Her sister, Maeve, had died before I was born. They had been inseparable, and her death had shattered my mother. But even in death, Maeve's presence lingered. She had appeared to my mother for years, silent but watchful. "When I became pregnant with you, she disappeared," my mother said. "I thought she was gone for good. But when I saw the blood on your cheek that night, I knew she had returned to protect you. It was Maeve's spirit that had been watching me all those years. Not an uninvited guest, but a guardian, silently shielding me from harm." "Is that why you never left this town?" I asked. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. I couldn't leave her alone. The events of that night left scars, but they also brought clarity. My Aunt Maeve had been my silent protector, her presence a reminder that even in death, love endures. For years, I had feared the shadows that lingered in my room. But now, I understood. They weren't there to harm me. They were there to keep me safe. It was the middle of the night when I was jolted awake by the doorbell. Not once, but repeatedly. Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. My heart was racing before I even opened my eyes. I remember lying there, frozen for a moment, thinking it had to be a dream. Who rings the doorbell at 3 a.m.? But the sound wouldn't stop. Adrenaline kicked in, and I stumbled out of bed, grabbing my phone as I made my way to the door. My house was silent, the kind of silence that pressed down on you. The doorbell continued as I approached, the sound sharp and insistent. I flicked on the porch light and peered through the peephole. My stomach dropped. No one was there. For a moment, I debated whether I should open the door, but curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I unlocked it and swung it open. The cold night air hit me, but the porch was empty. Then I looked down and saw them. Muddy footprints, leading from the porch into my house. My breath caught. I hadn't even noticed the faint, wet tracks on the hardwood floor behind me. Someone had already come in. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to lock the door and call the police, but a voice in my head whispered, "Check the house first." Maybe it was denial, or maybe I didn't want to explain to an officer why I thought muddy footprints were worth an emergency call. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and started following the tracks. They were smeared and uneven, as if someone had been dragging their feet. The prints led through the living room, past the couch, and toward the hallway. My hands were shaking so badly that the flashlight beam jittered across the walls. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded thin and weak, no response. The house felt wrong, like it wasn't my home anymore. Each creak of the floorboards made my skin crawl. The footprints veered into the guest bedroom. I hesitated. That room hadn't been used in months. Slowly, I pushed the door open, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. The room was empty, but the window, it was wide open. Panic started to set in. Someone had been in my house, and they might still be here. I slammed the window shut, locked it, and turned back to the footprints. They didn't end in the guest bedroom. They continued down the hallway toward my bedroom. I thought about leaving, running out the front door and never looking back. But where would I go? This was my home. I couldn't let fear drive me out of it. At least, that's what I told myself. So I followed the trail, each step heavier than the last. When I reached my bedroom door, it was ajar. I was sure I'd closed it before going to sleep. My hands were so sweaty I almost dropped the flashlight. Taking a deep breath, I nudged the door open with my foot. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was faint but unmistakable. Damp earth and rot. My room looked normal at first glance, but then the beam of my flashlight landed on my bed. My heart stopped. There, on the crisp white sheets, were more muddy footprints. They weren't human. They were larger, clawed, and unlike anything I'd ever seen. I backed out of the room, my chest tightening with fear. This wasn't just a break-in. Whatever had come into my house wasn't human. The logical part of my brain was screaming at me to call for help. But something deeper, more primal, told me I needed to stay silent. If this thing was still here, I didn't want it to know I'd found its trail. I crept back down the hallway, my ears straining for any sound. The house was deathly quiet, but that only made the tension worse. My phone was in my pocket, but I didn't dare take it out. The light from the screen might give me away. Then I heard it. A soft, wet, squelching noise, like something heavy moving across the floor. It came from the kitchen. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But I forced myself to move, inching toward the sound. When I reached the kitchen doorway, I peeked around the corner. The back door was wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze. I should have felt relief that whatever it was had left, but I didn't. Something wasn't right. I approached the back door cautiously, shining my flashlight outside. The backyard was empty, but the muddy footprints continued across the deck and into the grass. I couldn't bring myself to follow them. Instead, I locked the door, double-checked all the windows, and sat down in the living room, trying to calm my racing mind. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. On the wall by the front door, written in streaks of mud, were 3 words: "Let me in." My stomach churned. I hadn't seen the writing when I opened the door earlier. Had it been there the whole time? Or had it appeared after I'd opened the door? I didn't want to think about the implication. Just as I was starting to convince myself it was over, the doorbell rang again. My whole body went cold. This time, it was a single, deliberate chime. I didn't move. My eyes were glued to the door, my breath shallow. Slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I bolted upright, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and positioned myself behind the couch. The door creaked open. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, something stepped inside. It was tall, its form barely visible in the dim light. But its eyes, they glowed, a sickly yellow that pierced the shadows. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me. Then, without a sound, it turned and walked back into the hallway. Moments later, I heard the guest bedroom window creak open again. When I found the courage to check, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night, I couldn't. When the sun finally rose, I inspected the house. The footprints were gone, as if they'd never been there. Even the writing on the wall had vanished. But the back door was still unlocked, and the guest bedroom window was open again. I moved out a week later. I couldn't stay, not after what happened, but sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the doorbell ring, and when I do, I stay in bed, my heart pounding, and pray that it doesn't let itself in again. It started with a knock on the door, a firm, deliberate knock that echoed through the quiet of the evening. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the sudden sound jolted me out of my comfortable routine. When I opened the door, a delivery driver stood there, holding a medium-sized package. He wore a standard uniform, but something about him felt off. His face was unreadable, his eyes almost too piercing, like he was staring through me rather than at me. "Package for you," he said, his voice low and monotone. I glanced at the label. Sure enough, it had my name and address, but I didn't remember ordering anything. "Must be a mistake," I said, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, holding the package, as if waiting for something. When I hesitated, he finally placed it on the ground and took a step back. But he didn't leave. "Thanks," I muttered, awkwardly closing the door. Through the peephole, I could see him still standing there, staring at the door, unmoving. A chill crept up my spine. Who stands there like that? I watched for what felt like an eternity until he finally walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I picked up the package, my hands trembling slightly. It wasn't heavy, but the weight of the situation was suffocating. Inside, there was nothing out of the ordinary. A plain, black box with no sender information and no contents inside. It was completely empty. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was this some kind of prank? I checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. Yet, I couldn't shake the paranoia that had seeped into my bones. The house suddenly felt too quiet, like the silence was hiding something. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking. Delivery errors happen all the time, right? But as the hours dragged on, strange noises started echoing through the house. Faint tapping sounds, almost rhythmic, coming from somewhere below. My basement. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but when it happened again, louder this time, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, I made my way down to the basement. The air felt colder down there, heavier, like I was descending into another world. The tapping had stopped by the time I reached the bottom step, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I swept the flashlight across the room, its beam slicing through the darkness. At first, everything seemed normal. Boxes, old furniture, and a layer of dust that hinted at years of neglect. But then I saw it. The broken window. Glass shards littered the floor beneath it, and the curtain fluttered slightly, moved by the cold breeze seeping in. Panic set in. Someone had been in my house, or worse, they might still be here. I backed up toward the stairs, every muscle in my body tense. That's when I heard it. A faint shuffling noise behind me. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand. There was nothing there, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. I bolted back upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. I called the police, explaining what I had found. They arrived quickly, searching the basement and the surrounding area. But after a thorough check, they found nothing. No sign of an intruder, no footprints, nothing to suggest someone had broken in. They chalked it up to a random act of vandalism, assuring me it was safe. But it didn't feel safe. That night, I decided to check my security cameras. I hadn't looked at them earlier because, frankly, I hadn't thought I'd need to. Scrolling through the footage, everything seemed normal at first. The driver arriving, the package exchange, him walking away. But then, something chilling. In the footage, the driver didn't leave. He walked to the side of the house, crouched by the basement window, and disappeared out of frame. My heart raced as I fast-forwarded through the footage, hoping to see him leaving, but he never did. I rewound it over and over, my pulse pounding in my ears. He was still inside. Adrenaline surged through me as I grabbed a kitchen knife, my only means of defense. I knew I couldn't just sit there, waiting for something to happen. I had to act. I crept through the house, checking every room, every closet. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the creak of the floorboards under my feet. When I reached the basement door, I hesitated. The thought of going down there again made my stomach churn, but I had no choice. Slowly, I unlocked the door and descended the stairs, knife trembling in my hand. The air was icy, and every step felt like it echoed endlessly in the dark. At first, I saw nothing. The basement looked exactly as it had before. But then, in the far corner, I spotted a shadow that didn't belong. It moved. My flashlight flickered as I pointed it toward the figure. It was him, the delivery driver, crouched in the corner, his face pale and his eyes wide with an unnatural intensity. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was menacing, predatory. Before I could react, he lunged at me. I swung the knife wildly, barely grazing him as he knocked the flashlight out of my hand. Darkness consumed the room, and all I could hear was his heavy breathing and my own panicked gasps. I scrambled toward the stairs, heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to run. He grabbed my ankle, pulling me back down. I kicked as hard as I could, connecting with something soft. He let out a grunt of pain, giving me just enough time to break free. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands shook as I called the police again, barely able to get the words out. This time, when they arrived, they found him. He was still in the basement, sitting calmly in the same corner, as if nothing had happened. The officer's flashlight revealed something chilling, a knife in his hand, and a notebook filled with detailed notes about my daily routine. Even now, I can't shake the fear that grips me every time I hear a knock on the door. The driver was arrested, and the police assured me he wouldn't be a threat anymore. But the damage was done. My home no longer feels like a sanctuary. Every creak, every shadow sends my heart racing. I've installed new locks, upgraded my security system, and even moved to a new place. But the paranoia follows me. I've learned to trust my instincts, to never dismiss that gut feeling when something feels off. And most of all, I've learned that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones who hide in plain sight. So, the next time you hear an unexpected knock, think twice before you open the door. You never know what might be waiting on the other side. It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon. I was home alone, working on a few projects in the living room, when there was a sudden knock at the door. It wasn't the casual tap-tap you'd expect from a neighbor, but a loud, deliberate knock that sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at the clock. 2:13 p.m. Who knocks at that time? I peeked through the peephole, and there he was. A man in a faded blue uniform with a logo patch I couldn't quite read. He was holding a clipboard and had a tool belt slung around his waist. His face was calm but expressionless. "Good afternoon," he said when I opened the door slightly, keeping the chain on. "I'm with the gas company. There's been a report of a possible leak in the area. I need to inspect your lines." I hesitated. I hadn't smelled anything unusual, and there were no alerts from the utility company. But he held up a laminated ID card. My instinct screamed at me to say no, but before I could, he added, "This is mandatory. If there's a leak, your family's safety could be at risk." Reluctantly, I unlatched the door and let him in. He moved quickly, heading straight to the kitchen where the main gas line was located. I tried to follow, but he waved me off. "This won't take long," he said without turning around. Minutes turned into an hour. He walked back and forth between the kitchen, the basement, and the garage, muttering to himself and tapping the walls. Every time I asked if he'd found anything, he brushed me off with vague responses. Something felt off, but I couldn't quite place it. Then he disappeared. One moment, I could hear his heavy boots on the floorboards. The next, silence. I called out, "Hello? Are you done?" No answer. I walked around the house, checking each room, but there was no sign of him. I told myself he must have left, but my gut told me otherwise. My heart began to race as I approached the basement door, which was now slightly ajar. A door I knew I'd left closed. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, staring into the darkness below. The light switch was right there, but my hand hesitated. My pulse was pounding in my ears. "It's just your imagination," I whispered to myself, but the unease was suffocating. Finally, I flipped the switch. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered on, casting long, eerie shadows on the cement walls. "Sir?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. I'd lived in this house for years, but at that moment the basement felt alien, like it belonged to someone else. I took the first step down, then another. The creak of the wooden stairs echoed in the stillness. As I descended, the faint smell of damp earth and mildew grew stronger. Halfway down, I noticed something odd, a faint rhythmic sound. Tap. It was so faint that I had to hold my breath to hear it clearly. "Sir, are you still here?" I tried again, louder this time. The tapping stopped abruptly, plunging the space into an oppressive silence. My legs felt like lead as I reached the bottom of the stairs. The basement was cluttered but familiar. Old boxes, holiday decorations, and tools. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. And then I saw it. In the far corner, behind the old furnace, a shadow shifted. I froze. "Hello?" I managed to croak out. The shadow moved again, and a figure emerged. It was him, the utility worker, crouching low with his arms wrapped around his knees, his head tilted unnaturally to the side. His eyes were wide open, staring at me, but his face remained disturbingly blank. "What are you doing down here?" I demanded, trying to sound authoritative despite the terror rising in my chest. He didn't answer. Instead, he just stared, unblinking. My gut told me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. "Leave," I whispered, but he didn't move. And that's when I saw the faint smirk creep across his face. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My hands trembled as I locked it, pressing my weight against the door as if that alone could keep him out. My mind was racing. Who was this man? Why was he hiding in my basement? I grabbed my phone from the counter and dialed 911, but before I could press call, the sound of the basement door rattling made me jump. He was on the other side, jiggling the handle with deliberate, menacing slowness. "Leave now, or I'm calling the police," I yelled, my voice cracking. The rattling stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then I heard it. A faint scratching like nails dragging across the wooden door. I backed away, clutching my phone. The operator answered, but before I could speak, the scratching stopped, replaced by a low guttural laugh. My blood ran cold. "Someone's in my house," I whispered into the phone. "He's in the basement. Please send help." The operator assured me that officers were on their way, but I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The house felt impossibly quiet. Every creak and groan of the old structure amplified by my fear. I edged toward the front door, planning to leave and wait for the police outside, but just as I reached for the handle, a loud crash came from the basement. I spun around, heart hammering. The door to the basement was now wide open, swinging slightly as if taunting me. He was out. I ran to the nearest room and locked the door behind me. My breathing was ragged, and my hands fumbled as I tried to barricade the door with a chair. Through the thin walls, I could hear the heavy thud of boots moving through the house, deliberate and unhurried. He wasn't searching, he was stalking. "This isn't happening," I whispered, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The footsteps stopped just outside the room I was hiding in. My heart felt like it might burst as the doorknob twisted slowly, then rattled. He was trying to get in. But then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear any movement. Nothing. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, I mustered the courage to peek out. The hallway was empty, but the air felt heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I crept out cautiously, keeping my back to the wall and my phone dialed to 911 in case I needed to call again. As I moved through the house, I noticed something chilling. Doors that I knew I had closed were now open, and items were out of place. A picture frame lay shattered on the floor. The knife block in the kitchen was empty. Then I saw it. Written on the mirror in the hallway, in what looked like blood, were the words, "I'm not done yet." My knees buckled, and I had to grab the wall to steady myself. This wasn't just an intruder. This was someone who wanted to terrify me, someone who enjoyed the fear. I heard the distant wail of sirens and felt a wave of relief. Help was finally on the way, but that relief was short-lived. As I turned toward the living room to wait, I saw him standing there, knife in hand, his face now twisted into a sinister grin. He raised a finger to his lips, signaling me to stay quiet. The next few moments were a blur. I screamed as the police burst through the door, their shouts filling the house. The man lunged at me, but they tackled him before he could reach me. The knife clattered to the floor as they dragged him away, still laughing like it was all some sick game. The police searched the house thoroughly, documenting every detail. The man, whose ID turned out to be fake, refused to give his name or explain why he was there. They found tools in his bag that weren't for gas lines but for picking locks and disabling alarms. He'd planned this. He'd done it before. The officers reassured me that I was safe now, but the damage was done. My home no longer felt like mine. Every creak of the floorboards made my skin crawl. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, that smirk. Those eyes filled with malice. A detective visited the next day, asking if I'd noticed anything unusual in the days leading up to the incident. As we talked, I remembered the utility truck parked down the street earlier that week. It hadn't moved for days, but I hadn't thought much of it. Looking back, it was clear he'd been watching, planning. They also discovered that the blood on the mirror was red paint, likely from a tube he'd carried in his bag. It didn't make me feel any better. The message was still burned into my mind. I decided to stay with a friend for a while. The thought of being alone in that house was unbearable. Every time I thought about returning, I felt sick. It wasn't just the fear of him coming back. It was the knowledge that someone had invaded my space, my sanctuary, and turned it into a nightmare. A week later, the detective called me with an update. They'd matched the man's fingerprints to several other break-ins across the state. In one case, a family hadn't been as lucky as me. The details were gruesome, and I felt a fresh wave of nausea as he described the scene. But what he told me next was even worse. They'd searched the man's phone and found photos of my house. Some were taken from outside through the windows, but others were from inside. Inside my bedroom, my bathroom, places he should have never been. "We believe he entered your home at least once before," the detective said, his tone grim. "Possibly while you were out." I felt violated all over again. This wasn't just a random attack. He'd been watching me, studying me. The thought made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the image of him standing in my bedroom, looking through my things, planning his next move. The detective advised me to install a security system and change all my locks. I did everything he suggested, but it still didn't feel like enough. I started seeing his face everywhere. In the grocery store, at the gas station, even in my dreams. I couldn't escape him. It's been months now, but the fear hasn't gone away. I moved to a new house in a different neighborhood, but I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. Every knock at the door sends my heart racing. Every unexpected sound makes me jump. I can't trust anyone anymore. Sometimes I sit up at night, replaying the events in my mind, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't called the police in time. Would I even be here to tell this story? The thought haunts me. The man was sentenced to prison, but it doesn't feel like justice. He'll be out someday. And the idea of him walking free terrifies me. I've tried therapy, but no amount of talking can erase the memory of his face or the sound of his laugh. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. I let a stranger into my home because I ignored that gut feeling, and it nearly cost me everything. So, if you ever hear a knock at your door and something doesn't feel right, don't answer it. You never know who might be on the other side.